Good morning, everyone. Hi, Lise. Okay, we'll be waiting a couple of minutes and we will begin. Morning, Mushki.
Good morning. I'm just in the car, so I'm going to have my video off. Okay.
Hi,
Okay,
Shalamis, Natalie. I see someone new, Janet.
Yes, I knew. I was told about this by Jerry Rogan. And
Oh,
I
great.
don't know.
Okay.
I don't know who told her about it. I'm in California.
Welcome. If there are any terms that you don't understand, please make sure to ask me. There's also, did you join the WhatsApp group?
I
There's a
did.
WhatsApp group. Yeah, okay, good.
I
So
did.
there's some discussion that goes on there. So if there's, as with any new subject, some things might be unfamiliar, but don't worry, because in a couple of weeks you'll be totally familiar with the terms.
Well, I don't know. I studied it for a while with a rabbi in California, and it's still a lot. Thank you.
Okay, what I try to do over here in this class is to make it very, very practical. So, okay, good morning, Sina. Okay, we are going to start in 1 minute. Let me just mute everybody. 1 second. Okay, good morning, everybody. We are in chapter 10 of Likutei Amarim, and before we actually get into the meat and bones of this chapter, I'd like to do a quick recap so that we all can know exactly where we are, how we got to this point in Tanya. So the recap is very brief, and also just to remind everybody and anyone who's new that these classes are merely a summary of the chapter. When you learn it in depth, obviously there's a lot more detail and a lot more richness, but we try to do it justice in half an hour every week. Okay, so the recap up till now, when we have been learning Tanya, is that right off the bat, the Alter Rebbe introduces us to the concept that every Jew possesses two souls. Okay, so now we know we have two souls. That is chapter 1. Chapter 2 starts explaining the essence of the animal soul, right? We have a divine soul and we have an animal soul. And the reason why we are learning all about our divine soul and animal soul is to generate an awareness of our inner workings, and we will explain in a minute what that means, in order to have a choice, basically, and in order to dominate the animal soul to be able to control our impulses and our expressions of the animal soul within our body. So in chapter 2, the Alter Rebbe explains the essence of the animal soul, that it comes from a level called klipas noiga, which means that it is not completely impure. Its source is definitely in impurity, but there's a glimmer of good in that. And the animal soul is actually the source of either bad traits, which we possess, and also some good traits, because of the fact that there is good in this type of klipa called klipas noiga. Chapter 3 begins discussing the essence of the godly soul. And we learn how the godly soul is literally a part of Hashem above, even after coming into this world. So even though it has come into the world, we consider it a chelek Eloka mimal, and it is a part of God. All of this we learn actually in the beginning of Tanya to explain the difference between the tzaddik, the rasha, and the Beinoni. So we're going to understand why I'm doing this recap now, because this chapter discusses the tzaddik, next chapter discusses the rasha, and the chapter after that, chapter 12, introduces us finally to the Beinoni, which is our aspiration to become. So just to recap also, very slightly, the difference between a tzaddik and a Beinoni is that the behavior is the same, but internally they are very different people. Now, what are internal powers? This is very important to understand before we delve into this chapter. The internal powers are not what we do, not the expression of our souls, but it is our intellect and emotions, seichel and midos. Firstly, in the godly soul, the intelligence of the godly soul, intelligence of godliness and understanding godliness, brings or produces feelings of love and fear of Hashem. So the intellect and emotions are intrinsically connected, as we have explained many, many times. In other words, the powers of the soul, are the inner workings of the soul. It's the potential. It's not the external, what you see. In chapter 4, the Tanya goes on to explain the external part. So the expression of the soul, or the way the Alter Rebbe calls it, the garments of the soul. And this is basically our behavior, how we think, how we speak, and what we do. Thought, speech, and action. When we express our godly soul, we can attain a higher level than the godly soul itself. And in chapter 6, when the Alter Rebbe explains the powers of the animal soul, which are the emotions and the intellect, the garments of the animal soul, when we let that express itself, it can be more damaging than the level of the animal soul itself. In other words, when we do mitzvahs and we let our godly soul prevail, we are elevating ourselves to a level higher than our godly soul. When we unfortunately fall into temptation and let our animal soul express itself, we descend to a lower level than the animal soul itself. Because the animal soul comes from the level of klipas noiga, whereas by sinning, we descend to the level of complete klipa, unholiness, concealment of Hashem. And actually, in chapter 7, the Alter Rebbe went into the difference between klipa and klipas noiga, and we explained that since the animal soul of a Jew comes from klipas noiga is a category that is kind of neutral and can actually be elevated, which is going to kind of introduce us to this topic in this chapter, which in a tzaddik, not only has the animal soul been elevated, it has actually been transformed. So chapter 8 continued the subject of klipa and klipas noiga and what is forbidden and what is permitted. And if also, depending on our intention, we can elevate, neutral activities, right? We mentioned that. And chapter 9, we actually spoke last week in a lot of detail about the location of the two souls, which help us to then choose which soul we are going to access and which soul we are going to use at any given moment in time. And this is basically the inner struggle, because the inner powers of the animal soul and the godly soul, which are the emotions and the intellect, are primarily found in the mind and in the heart. In the animal soul, primarily in the heart. In the godly soul, primarily in the mind. But each soul demands control on external parts of the soul, on the expression of the soul, the actions, the behavior, and the body, etc. And therefore, each soul wants complete dominance over the inner and outer workings of the soul, and we discussed at length how to actually, instead of using the intellect of the animal soul to either justify, restrict, or guide the emotions of the animal soul, we can choose to produce healthy emotions by accessing the wisdom of and the intellect of our godly soul. Okay, so this is a little bit of an introduction and a segue into chapter 10, where we are going to be learning about the tzaddik. Now, Tanya is not actually a book for tzaddikim. We are potential Beinonis. We are not meant to even be a tzaddik. But the reason why that Alter Rebbe brings a whole chapter now discussing the tzaddik is for us to learn from the tzaddik. So firstly, it's always good to know what's higher than ourselves, right? In order to understand ourselves. There is also a mitzvah of having a relationship with a tzaddik. Mitzvah is uladavka ba, you shall cleave to him. So it's good to know what we're cleaving to, right? We also learn from the ways of a tzaddik. We know we don't have to be a tzaddik, but we do learn from his ways. And when we cleave to a tzaddik, especially, some of his spirituality rubs off on us, right? And our neshama connects to his neshama. Our soul connects to the soul of a tzaddik. And the difference, we're going to get to it in a moment, what exactly is a tzaddik, but this is really what the Alter Rebbe explains in this chapter. So the tzaddik, in a tzaddik, the godly soul has succeeded in controlling not only behavior, in other words, the externals, but also the inner workings of the animal soul. In other words, the animal soul has become godly in a tzaddik. The animal soul, at this point in a tzaddik, understands and desires godliness because it takes pleasure and delight in godliness. Now, in a Beinoni, right, the godly soul has prevailed but has not taken over. The godly soul has prevailed and has control of the outer garments, our behavior, but not our inner workings. The animal soul's inner workings have remained animalistic, natural, and have not been transformed. In a Russia, right, in a Russia, the godly soul has gained control over neither, not the inner workings nor the outer workings, and therefore there exists the possibility of sin, right? In this chapter, actually, we're going to concentrate on two different types of a tzaddik. In the next chapter, the Alter Rebbe will explain to us two different types of a Russia, but in this chapter, we're going to understand two different types of a tzaddik based on the workings and the structure of the soul, and the battle which the souls wage, as described in the previous chapter. Okay. Now there are two types of tzaddikim. There is a complete tzaddik and there is an incomplete tzaddik. A tzaddik gomor is a complete tzaddik, and a tzaddik she'eino gomor is an incomplete tzaddik. Now it's really difficult to understand that, because what is meant by an incomplete tzaddik? Like, either a tzaddik is a tzaddik or he's not a tzaddik, right? Because if he were not completely a tzaddik, he would be a Beinoni. So this chapter explains this concept. So the Alter Rebbe starts off, and we actually mentioned this in the beginning, but now the Alter Rebbe goes into greater detail, that the complete tzaddik, when we talk about a tzaddik gomor, we use the expression tzaddik v'toiv loy, a tzaddik who has good. Now, traditionally, when we read about this in the Gemara or in different places and commentaries, when we say tzaddik v'toiv loy, a tzaddik who has good, and tzaddik v'ra loy, and tzaddik who has bad, we're talking about what happens to the tzaddik in this world. So if we were to say, oh, you know that tzaddik, he has everything going for him. He has a good life. Everything in this world is good for him. Or we would say, oh, poor tzaddik, he really has a hard life in this world. That would be tzaddik v'ra loy. Like, he's poor, he struggles, he suffers with different ailments, let's say, right? But here the Alter Rebbe comes and gives us a completely different understanding of these descriptions of a complete tzaddik and incomplete tzaddik. A tzaddik, the basic premise of a tzaddik is that he has succeeded in transforming the inner workings of the animal soul, as explained, right? In other words, now the animal soul understands, desires, and has pleasure from godliness. But what's the difference between these two different types of tzaddikim? So, first of all, a complete tzaddik loves godliness and hates unholiness. And his love is just as complete as his hate. So a tzaddik gomer, a complete tzaddik, has complete love and complete hate, right? A tzaddik that is not complete has a vestige of love or understanding for pleasure, for worldly pleasures. He is not at all controlled or conflicted. He knows where he stands, but he understands the concept. In actual fact, he can have a little empathy for somebody who takes pleasure in this world because it makes a little bit of sense, right? A complete tzaddik, though, loves Hashem completely and therefore despises completely anything that is ungodly. An incomplete tzaddik despises ungodliness, but not for itself. It despises ungodliness for how it contradicts godliness, for how it is an obstacle to serving Hashem, but not for what it is. A complete tzaddik hates ungodliness for what it is, not for what it causes. But even so, we're talking about tzaddik, right? So a tzaddik has completely transformed his animal soul. So when we say there's a vestige, it's like the example of kosher, right? When 1/60th of a drop of milk falls into a pot of meat, right? It's nullified. So this vestige in the tzaddik is nullified, and therefore he is a tzaddik, right? A complete tzaddik loves Hashem more than he loves himself. A complete tzaddik may even understand pleasure theoretically, but he will not feel the pleasure, right? So just to give you an example of like practically how this actually works in a tzaddik, a beinoni, just let me find where I wrote it all. Okay, so for example, let's say a tzaddik was walking by a bank, right? A tzaddik has absolutely no desire whatsoever to rob the bank, right? The incomplete tzaddik might have an understanding of why a person would want to rob a bank. He gets it, but it's like not conflicted. It's like a fleeting thought and off he goes, right? And a beinoni, the thought is more developed. Like, wow, also the beinoni is not conflicted, right? That's the Russia. The Russia is really conflicted, but the beinoni has a greater understanding and can understand why someone would actually really want to rob a bank. The thought is more developed. It's not so much on a subconscious level, right? So that's just an example of the thought processes in a tzaddik or a beinoni. So now, let's talk for a minute about the difference between love and pleasure, because a tzaddik loves Hashem and does not take pleasure in ungodly activities or thoughts or actions, right? So you can love someone, but not derive pleasure from that person. That is possible, right? So in an incomplete tzaddik, the understanding of pleasure, a vestige of evil still exists. In other words, he gets the pleasure, but because he loves Hashem more than he loves himself, he's not conflicted and has no interest, but he does have an understanding of it. A complete tzaddik has transformed the pleasure. He doesn't even understand the pleasure. So he loves Hashem and has no pleasure whatsoever in this world. A complete tzaddik, when he eats, for example, right? And we derive pleasure from eating. We have taste buds and the food tastes good, etc. When we normal people, at least I am, when we eat, we take pleasure in the taste of the food and what it does, you know. An incomplete tzaddik has a vestige of that, and a complete tzaddik feels the pleasure of godliness while he is eating, because he is so one with the will of Hashem, and he's eating for the totally right reasons. So a complete love of Hashem causes a complete pleasure of Hashem, which is on the level that we mentioned in the last chapter, the level of pleasure that is represented by water. It's called Ahavas Hatanugim, a love of delight and pleasure. And that is represented by water. It's a calm love because you've arrived at your destination. You've found your water, right? Now, what's interesting about this is that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, whose Hilula we commemorate on Lag BaOmer shortly, he wrote in Kabbalah that there are very few complete tzaddikim, and he calls them by the expression B'nai Aliyah, the sons of ascent. Why are they called B'nai Aliyah? The reason that they're called B'nai Aliyah is because a tzaddik converts evil and makes it ascend to holiness, which in turn causes a reciprocal reaction of the presence of Hashem coming down into our lives and to this world, right? A complete tzaddik does not merely serve Hashem to quench his thirst, right? So that's what we called last week the love, fiery love of searching for the water, right? It's a yearning, right? So you're gonna go, you're so thirsty that you want Hashem and you do everything to reach the destination of finding godliness and taking pleasure in godliness. But a complete tzaddik does his avodah purely for the sake of Hashem, not to quench his own thirst, in the manner of a child who exerts himself more for his parents than for himself. In other words, he is ready to sacrifice his life for his parents. It's an altruistic desire to please Hashem and make his presence obvious wherever you are. Okay, so basically, this is in a nutshell the workings of a tzaddik, and not only a tzaddik, but the complete tzaddik and an incomplete tzaddik. So when we use the expressions tzaddik gomor, a complete tzaddik is tzaddik v'toiv loi, it's all good. It's all being transformed. His animal soul is completely transformed. When we use the term tzaddik she'enoi gomor, a tzaddik that is incomplete, and we say tzaddik v'raloi, we are not referring necessarily to the bad things that happen to the tzaddik. We are referring that he has a vestige of evil, and this vestige of evil is actually very difficult for us to relate to because it is we are not on that level. But here's the clincher: v'raloi. That vestige of evil, loi means to him. That vestige of evil is subjugated to him, to the tzaddik. In other words, even though there is this vestige, and this vestige is so slight, and it is not obvious, and it does not cause any conflict whatsoever, and he is completely in tune with Hashem's desires, but because he can understand the desire for unholiness, it's called an incomplete tzaddik, but it is subjugated to him. In other words, this evil does not control him. It is under his control. He dominates it. It does not dominate him. He owns it. It does not own him. And that is obviously the difference between there is no struggle in a tzaddik. Tzaddik has absolutely no struggle. Now the Beinoni has a struggle, but on a more Also, the Beinoni is not conflicted once he reaches the level of Beinoni, and we're going to see that the Rasha is extremely conflicted, and the evil dominates him. But in the Beinoni, even though he appears to be the same outwardly as the Tzaddik, his animal soul is alive and well, and he does have these involuntary thoughts, fleeting thoughts, which then, as a Beinoni, he chooses not to develop, not to justify, not to restrict. He just pushes it away. The Alter Rebbe explains to us, and there's going to be lots of different techniques throughout the whole of Tanya of what he does with those thoughts, but he is not conflicted, but they are obvious. They are not nullified within the Beinoni's inner workings, whereas in the Tzaddik, they are nullified, and especially in a Tzaddik Gomer, they don't even exist. Okay. Any observations, questions?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Okay. Okay. Complete tzaddik, not complete tzaddik. Don't tzaddikim come as tzaddikim, like he comes complete or he comes not complete. It's not like I'm going to strive to be a Benoni, right? Or I'm going to strive not to be Rosh or Ra, but a tzaddik just comes. Isn't that soul already imbued in him, and he comes in as a complete or a not complete? And what's the purpose of having a not complete tzaddik? I don't understand that part, meaning what's his struggle? If he comes into the world with a soul that's not complete tzaddik, is he supposed to learn something from that, or are we supposed to learn something from that?
That's a very good question. I actually really like that question, Sina. So there's a few things. There's a few parts to your question, right? The beginning of the question was, first of all, does a tzaddik become a tzaddik, or is a tzaddik born a tzaddik, right? So we know from David HaMelech, who was a tzaddik, right? But he became a tzaddik. He writes in Tehillim, "V'libi halol bekirbi." My heart is empty within me. What does that mean? That means that he transformed his animal soul. He now has an empty place where the animal soul was in the heart. It's empty. That's how he writes poetically in Tehillim, right? So we do see tzaddikim who did work on themselves and became tzaddikim. Is that our mission? No. We do not have to become tzaddikim. And that's the whole innovative philosophy of Tanya, that a lot of people think that they were put on this world to become a tzaddik. Yes, tzaddikim were chosen, and they may have to work to reach the level, but that's not everybody. Majority of people are here to become a Beinoni, not a tzaddik. Now, some are born and some work on themselves, and one of the reasons also that Hashem spread out true tzaddikim, especially complete tzaddikim, amongst the generations, is because this world is a world of concealment. This world conceals godliness. But if we were never to see sparks of revelations of godliness, we wouldn't know what there is to strive for. So therefore, Hashem put two things into this world to reveal godliness to us. One is tzaddikim, and the other are miracles. So when a miracle occurs, we can with confidence say, wow, that was the open hand of Hashem. But we are discussing tzaddikim. So one of the reasons that a tzaddik is here is to reveal godliness to us, to show us what is godliness all about? What are we striving for? What are we trying to reveal by overcoming our animal soul? So that's number one. Now, what is the difference for us between a complete tzaddik and an incomplete tzaddik? Really and truly nothing, but we do the reason why Tanya teaches us about a complete tzaddik and an incomplete tzaddik is for us to understand what a complete Rasha is and an incomplete Rasha is. So, should I give you a sneak peek? Sneak peek is that none of us over here is a complete Rasha, because complete Rasha is total evil, right? According to the definitions of Tanya, and I don't want to jump the gun because we're going to discuss the Rasha and the Beinoni and everything, but according to the definitions of Tanya, a person could be sinning very rarely. In other words, 95% of the time or 99% of the time, he's doing mitzvahs and is connected with godliness and does the will of Hashem. But because there's a possibility of sin, he is on the level of Russia, but it's not the level of Russia that we colloquially use normally, right? Evil person, demon with like, horns coming out of, no. A Russia could be actually a very, very fine person. Just he has the possibility of sinning occasionally, but that's the incomplete Russia. And the complete Russia always sins. And the reason we learn about the tzaddik is to understand the Russia, to understand ourselves.
That makes sense. So it's used to give us a clearer picture of how to identify for our own lives.
Absolutely.
But it's not really
Absolutely.
affecting the tzaddik. I mean, the tzaddik is.
Yeah, the tzaddik is who the tzaddik is.
For him,
The
it's for
tzaddik,
us.
so the tzaddik still serves Hashem, right? And the tzaddik on his level can go up or down, but he's still a tzaddik.
What on earth would make a tzaddik go down? I don't understand.
So,
Like down?
so I don't know if you remember and we're going to get to it eventually, but in the introduction of Shar HaYichud VaEmunah, the gateway of faith and unity of Hashem, the Alter Rebbe brings the example of a phrase in the Gemara which says Sheva Yipol Tzadik Vakum, that a tzaddik falls 7 times and gets up. Now, what in heaven's name doesn't mean a tzaddik falling, right? So the Alter Rebbe brings the example of a ladder, that when we climb a ladder there and we go from rung to rung, there is a moment where you don't have firm footing. You have to take your foot off in order to put it onto the next level. And that, he says, is what is considered falling for the tzaddik, where he is going to the next level, but yet he is not, he's insecure because he's completely left the last level, but he's striving to the upper level. But it's also a very, we discussed it then, and we will in Mirz Hashem learn it again, but it's also a very important lesson for our lives, that when we go from level to level, there is this period of insecurity. And since we learn from the tzaddik that he falls 7 times, but yet gets up, what about us? I mean, we can fall numerous times, but yet we strive and we get up. Again, we don't actually have to understand the workings of a tzaddik. What we do have to understand is how it applies to us and how we can use that in our lives. Okay, any other comments or observations?
That was a great question, Sina, and kind of thanks for answering that. That was really good. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Good to see you, Shalavet. So again, yeah, go ahead.
I just want to say it's so nice to re-engage with this. I can feel the inspiration and it's lovely. Thank you.
Oh, thank you and welcome. We hope to see you again. Okay, anybody else? Okay, so we will see you all next week. Mirz Hashem.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Sure. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You too.